Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on another snowy day. First, I want to welcome you to CCV, which I hope Joyce is going to do in more detail for us. But I'm so excited to be here this morning. For those of you who were able to be at the event last night, hopefully this will be a chance to sort of dive deeper into the conversation. For those of you who weren't able to be there, I understand, 20 inches of snow at my house. We will do a brief overview to sort of invite you into the topic. And I think that for me, bringing these events together has really been about the conversation. So I'm hopeful that we're all here because we're curious and want to think a little bit more about issues that are being experienced, the experiences of boys and especially young men in Vermont and in the United States and in the world. And with that, I'm going to introduce Joyce Judy, wonderful president of CCV, and I'm going to steal Dan's line, which is, Joyce is the person who has potentially signed more college diplomas in the state than any other person in the history of Vermont, for which we're incredibly grateful.
Thank you, and I would really like to just welcome all of you to CCV. And for people who aren't familiar with CCV, this is one of our 12 locations that are strategically located throughout the state. And we're so grateful to be a co-host of this event. And for those of you who attended last night, I think you're going to have a chance to dive a little deeper and hear a little more conversation in some different ways and some different voices. And what I will do is I'll introduce the panelists, and then we'll ask Richard, before we dive into the questions, to do sort of a mini keynote. So, our panelists, starting off, Richard Reeves. He is president of the American Institute for Boys and Men and a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. He's pioneered a lot of new thinking about complex challenges, and I think you're going to hear a lot about that today, facing modern-day males. He is also the author of Dream Hoarders, and most recently, the book in the back of Men and Boys, Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Welcome, Richard. And before I go any further, one of the things that I wanted to be, that I think came across loud and clear last night, and I want to just emphasize it here, is when we're talking today about men and boys, it's not at the exclusion or because we don't need to keep a focus on women and girls. So this isn't a zero-sum game in this conversation. It's really, we have to keep working with the issues around women and girls. They still face many, many disadvantages. But at the same time, we also need to look at the disengagement of men and boys. So I don't for a minute want people to think that we're talking about this because we've moved on from girls and women, they're all good. Nope, this is about really looking at a problem that we also need to address in addition to keep moving forward with women and girls. Next, I'd like to introduce Ken Cadow, who is a longtime educator who currently serves as the co-principal at Oxbow Union High School in Bradford. He is also the author of Gather, and if you haven't had a chance to read that book, I would just really encourage you, because what that does is it so grounds us in all the things that we're going to be talking about. It just is, he was a finalist for the 2023 National Book Award for Young People's Literature. That's how good it is. So I would encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read it, to read it. Thank you, Ken, for joining us today. Next, I want to introduce Ted Castle. And Ted is the owner and president of Rhino Foods. And this is a company that has received numerous awards, including the Forbes magazine's Small Giants Award. And I just have to say that I think for many of us that work and spend time in Chittenden County, Rhino Foods is one of those businesses that always emerges as a place that is great to work for, and they also are so welcoming and work with so many populations that we're going to talk about today. And they give people a chance, they invite them in, and then they figure out how to support them. And I'm really anxious to hear Ted talk about that. So welcome, Ted. And Sara Vargo. and welcome Sara. Sara serves as the Assistant Director of the GEAR UP Program for Vermont Student Assistance Corporation. Most of us know that as VSAC. And also want to introduce the CEO of VSAC, which is sitting in the front row. I'm glad you're in the front row, Scott. But Sara, through her job, sees and supports thousands of Vermonters every year and deals a lot with issues every day about the things we're going to talk about and sees them firsthand. And so I am thrilled to have Sara join us. Welcome, Sara. So now I'm going to ask Richard to give us a brief overview, a mini of what he talked about last night, and then we'll launch into some conversation. So Richard.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that kind welcome, and I will keep this brief because I'm very anxious to get into the conversation. And you've already done one of the things that I typically start with, Joyce, which is to emphasize that this is not zero sum. The other thing I'll add to that, and it relates to my previous work on class, is that if we think of this through a class lens, I think part of the problem is that, towards the top of society and top of many institutions, we still face a gender gap in the way we're used to thinking about it, right? And underrepresentation of women, particularly in politics and in many areas of business life and so on too. But if we look at the kind of whole distribution, if we look at kind of what's happening in working class communities, or we look at what's happening in wages more generally, we see a different picture. Sometimes that's referred to as like the apex problem, which is that we're just looking at the apex of society and we're not looking at the whole of society. And if we allow ourselves to kind of think about both at once, then we'll see that, yeah, there's a whole bunch more we need to do, particularly at the top. For women and girls, but then when you look at the rest of society, you actually see a different problem emerging. And you even see that in the higher education system. So, you'll see that community colleges, for example, are actually skewed towards female representation much earlier even than 4 years did. And one of the things I find quite interesting as I'm out and about talking about this is regional publics are where a lot of the action is and where I'm doing a lot of my talking, as well as community colleges. So like places like River Falls, Wisconsin, Tacoma in Washington State, etc. Those are the places where they're seeing these big gender skews. It's not in the Ivy League colleges, by and large, where we're seeing it, right? And so I think that class dimension is something that kind of connects my previous work to this work and to the work you're doing here too. So I'm just going to touch on a couple of things. The education gaps, I'm sure we'll get into. I mentioned these last night, but there's a very big gender gap in education now, but the other way round from the one we had before. So college campuses are now 60-40 female, male. There's a bigger gender gap today than there was in the 70s. It's just the other way round. In the average school district in the US, boys are a grade level behind in English and literacy, a full grade level behind on average. About even in math, but the big gaps are in kind of literacy. The top 10% of high school students ranked by GPA is 2/3 female, 1/3 male. So if you just measure by GPA, you see these very big differences. And we see much more disengagement and disconnection from boys in school. They're much, much more likely to say they don't enjoy school, they don't see the point of school. 23% of boys in K-12 schools in the US have been diagnosed with a developmental disability. It's 23%, it's almost 1 in 4. Which suggests to me that it's a system that's maybe not working for them rather than them that's actually disabled. And it's just kind of a sense of like, what's the point of education? One of the reasons I'm kind of borderline obsessed with the share of male teachers is we've seen the share of male teachers fall from 33% to 23% in our K-12 schools. And I think that sends a message about the coding of education, whether that's male or female or not. So I think it really matters, especially in subjects like English. And a lot of our boys end up actually, frankly, not seeing the point of education. And I'm going to quote Ken, page 298 of his spectacular book, if I can just say this. This is his protagonist, Ian, talking about the education system in his inimitable style. You go to school so you can keep going to school, so you can make enough money to hire the people who didn't like school to come and do all the shit on your to-do list you never figured out how to do yourself because you were always in goddamn school, eating school food while the deer you could be eating belongs to a herd that's getting so goddamn big they're eating everyone's pea crop and crapping all over the playing fields. It makes you need to take a big breath. Beautiful writing, thank you. But also, yeah, I think we all know boys like that. I think some of us have had boys like that in our families, and it's one of the reasons why thinking about our education system in a male-friendly way is hugely important. And our failure actually to kind of send our boys out into the world from school feeling good about themselves, or college feeling good about themselves, I think can add to a sense of dislocation and disequilibrium generally. And the mental health crisis we see playing out for girls and boys, men and women, is playing out a little bit differently for the two of them. We don't do a good enough job of screening for mental health problems among boys. It's not covered by the Affordable Care Act, for example. And I think that's one of the reasons we don't detect mental health problems among boys until too late. And it might be one reason why the suicide rate among young men has risen by more than a third just since 2010. We lose 40,000 men to suicide every year, and the suicide rate among men is 4 times higher than it is among women, and rising. And so I think that understanding what's happening to that mental health crisis is hugely important. Very often that's underlined by issues around isolation. We see growing levels of friendlessness and isolation among boys and young men especially, which are risk factors for some of these mental health problems. So again, back to the non-zero sum, we see equally troubling trends around female mental health, somewhat differently, and I think getting the attention finally that they deserve, but they are playing out differently, and I think that's incredibly important that we're able to hold that thought in our heads. In terms of family life, if you kind of don't come well out of school and you're struggling a little bit in education and you're maybe not sure about your own role in society, which I think some men do now feel, I think it just makes it a little bit harder around family formation. And the dramatic change we've seen, the positive change we've seen in the economic relation between men and women in the labour market, which has been, I think, magnificent. I mean, I think the progress we've made, whilst not complete in terms of women's wages, has been amazing. And one of the big effects of that has been to put a big question mark next to what does it mean to be a father? Thank God that no longer it's defined as just, well, be a breadwinner, right? You're going to have to be a breadwinner because that's the economic dependency between men and women. But if you're not that, what are you? And actually what we see is a lot of fathers struggling to kind of recast their role in this changed world and unable to kind of meet the old definition of fatherhood, which we don't want to bring back anyway. A lot of these men end up feeling like they're unneeded, that they're being left behind, that they are surplus to requirements. And feeling surplus to requirements is literally fatal. And so recasting fatherhood for the modern age is, I think, a huge task. One of the statistics that stopped me in my tracks when I was working on the book was that right now, the dissolution of the relationship between mum and dad very often means the fatherlessness of the child. And in fact, in your own book, Gather, we see the kind of father moves away. So he literally ends up down in Tennessee, where I now live, Ian's father, and not in his life at all. And actually that's a very common pattern. So within 6 years of their parents separating, a third of American children don't see their father again. I just think there's numbers that we can't live with, that we shouldn't live with, and we need to send a message that fathers really, really, really matter. Hugely. And I think there it comes a question of like, what does it mean to be a man? I'm sure the thing I'll close with. And then the last kind of couple of data points I'll just put on is like wages. I think, most people know here that wages for working class men have stagnated over the last few decades. By 2019, most American men were earning less than most American men did in 1979. I'll say that again. By 2019, most American men were earning less than most American men did in 1979. That is not for nothing. Most American men could expect to earn less over the course of their lifetimes than their fathers did. That's not for nothing. And that is not because of the rise of women in the labor force. It's because of other factors. It's because of globalization. It's because of trade. It's because of all kinds of things that we could have a long policy discussion about. But them's the facts. And so what you've got is a group of men who see their own wages lower than their father's wages, who see themselves uncertain in their role in society, an education system that doesn't feel very friendly to them for one reason or another, and they end up lost. They end up vulnerable, I think, to the claims of reactionaries, that the reasons they're suffering is because society's turned against them, because women don't want them, or because feminism's gone too far, or take whatever trope you want. They become vulnerable to that claim because of our neglect of their problems. If you don't address problems, they can become grievances. And if problems become grievances, they can be exploited. And they can very often be exploited for reactionary purposes. And the solution to that is not to blame the people who are being attracted to those reactionary voices. It is to cut off the supply lines to them by straightforwardly and honestly and loudly loudly addressing the problems of boys and men so that they do not feel neglected and don't become vulnerable. And then that will get us to the question, like, what does it mean to become a man? And we'll get into all of that, I'm sure, in this discussion, or not. But I just wanted to, I'm going to quote your book once more. I hope you don't mind. Perhaps you were going to quote these too. But there's this kind of absolutely lovely line about masculinity, which I'm going to use a lot now, because I don't think there is a definition of masculinity, and I certainly don't think it's something you write down. I think it's something you live. So here's what happens to Ian. He's asked, and I guess he's about 16 and a half at this point, in the swimming pool where the girl swims up to him. And she says, "Are you a man or a boy? Are you a man or a boy?" And he said, this is now in Ian's voice, "I don't even know how to answer that." I might have chuckled a little. You can think about that question for years. Maybe until you know, you become the answer. You become the answer. And I think that idea of like becoming the answer of what it means to be a man is something a lot of men are struggling with now, and that's the heart of our debate today.
Great. Thank you so much. So Ken, I would like to start with you. And when you read Richard's book and listened now to his remarks, I'm curious how this resonates with you as a co-principal of a high school.
Well, I'm, enormously and on every level. I think one of the big challenges that our boys have, that all of our kids, that many of our kids, and when I'm talking about boys today, I'm talking really more specifically about boys who struggle. Because there are plenty of our kids plenty of boys for whom the system's working. And they're the ones who grow up to study this stuff and make the policy for the most part. And so, unfortunately, we continue the problem. And Joyce, I'm going to quote you quoting me last night. We have an education system that really celebrates no. It emphasizes no over know-how. And so we have a lot of folks who know enough to develop great policy. And when we don't emphasize know-how to an equal level in the same building and under the same roof and in the same classrooms, we get this policy that we don't know how to implement. And we really need both, and we need to do it better. So I think that's, I would say that there's one place, Richard, where I'm sure you hear this all the time, but the red shirting, I don't want to shift how we treat half of the public because the system's busted. And we need to change the system. It's a desperate need.
Well, Ken, thank you. And for people that were wondering what the know and the know-how last night, it's just one of those passages in your book that really struck me. Because actually, when we were driving up, I was talking with my husband about my comments, and I said, maybe I'll leave that section out. And he said, no, that's Jeffrey. That is my nephew, who in school, he's very smart, but he's not a know kind of kid. He's a know-how, and he can do anything with his hands. In our current education system, we so value the know, and sometimes we undervalue or don't value the know-how. So now I'd like to shift to Sara. And Sara, ask you work with a lot of these kids that both Ken and Richard have talked about. And so talk to me from a counselor perspective. How do these comments, how do they come across for you every day?
Yeah, so in my current role, I actually don't work with those students so much, but I'm supporting folks who do.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that our counselors do really well is they meet students where they are. So we are seeing students, like actually hoping to make sure that they feel seen. We're listening to them. And we're noticing how important that is for all of our students, and maybe even more in particular for our male students, that really being seen and heard and hearing about kind of valuable the know-how is and how you can implement that into a plan moving forward. And across VSAC, we really do a lot of that on different levels, right? So no matter where you are in the developmental place, if you're in 7th grade, if you're in 11th grade, if you are an adult learner, we're trying to help you to connect with that.
So now I want to shift gears a little bit to Ted, and sort of in some ways fast forward, because now we're going to ask you some questions from a workforce perspective. But I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly because we've seen in Vermont a steep drop in participation of young men. And I'm curious how this drop in participation has played out at Rhino and what you're seeing.
I was born in 1952, so look around the room. I might be the oldest one in the room here. So 52.
I don't know.
Rochester, New York, upper middle class, amazing parents, supported me, paid for college, could play some sports. So sort of I had everything going. So it's like, for me to think about this with a different lens is the opposite of what I've been doing probably the last 10 years, at least of my life, and especially the last 4 when I've started to dig into more about race and the social economic situations, and part of a group called White Men for Racial Justice. So usually on these types of things, I can wing it, but I didn't. So I've turned it, Richard, I got to tell you, like, things have got to be lighting up for you. I've been Googling you like crazy.
That's who's doing it.
Yeah. So luckily my son Ned, you got to listen to Ezra Klein's interview. You'll know everything about this guy. So like, I've been listening to that a lot. And I would describe this as there's sort of things you know, there's things you know you don't know, and then there's things you don't know. So I would say thank you, because like this idea of opening up things that I didn't not know about it. I didn't even know that I didn't know about it. So I've been focused much more on the things that would make me more intelligent as a business leader. And Ken, you just said something that I think I hope we get into is, I think the system is made for people like myself. And so how do we, as white men leaders, think about other people that didn't have the same lived experience? And so that's my big takeaway in the last 10 years, is to think about mindset of business leaders, because I actually believe business is where the action is. So I tend to look at everything from a business perspective and know that people at Rhino are at Rhino 2,080 hours a year if they don't work overtime. And so we really focus on not trying to figure out who to bring in, but when they're there, what can we do to support them? So I just wanted to make that introduction because my lens on this would be really a learning perspective. We don't have a lot of young men coming to Rhino. We never have. So when you talk about frontline workers, you're talking about people that are going to work for $18 an hour now. And I think we can talk about what we're trying to do differently than other people, but I would say we never have. Like I checked, we have 240 people, and we only have 10 that would fall into that group. We do work a lot with the refugee community and people that are previously incarcerated. So I would say the young men that come to Rhino for an entry-level job are people that have been really in trouble. They've had substance abuse issues or incarceration issues. So we're, from a business perspective, we don't have a lot that are coming.
How do they find their way to Rhino?
Because we don't do background checks.
Mm-hmm.
We are probably considered a recovery-friendly workplace. So like I'm not trying to say this is the group that's coming to Rhino,
Yeah.
but if you were talking about young men in Vermont, in Chittenden County, that's who's coming to Rhino. Mm-hmm. So in a way, that question is that's not what drives Rhino. And now that I'm Richard Reeves, like I know stuff now. I know stuff, right? I think about things in a different lens. Like, so for me, I think about how different I grew up. Mm-hmm. And so I can spin that really quickly and say, that's why it worked for me.
Is that term recovery friendly, was the term you just used, Ted? Is that a well-known term? I haven't come across that term before. Is that something that's used? It's becoming a term? I think that's super interesting, because actually the thing about banning the box is like, the data on that's really complicated. Actually, it turns out that it probably wouldn't apply here, but banning the box actually reduced the employment of black men. There was this completely counterintuitive result. Doesn't sound like that's happening for you, and it may not be an issue here, but this recovery-friendly thing is super interesting because, of course, and I mean, actually, it's Ian's mom in your book, but more generally, it's kind of like people who've had a history of substance abuse.
Yeah.
Actually, so I love this idea of that being kind of recovery-friendly, and I think that would be somewhat more male folk. It would be for everybody, but given that it's more likely to be men who are suffering from substance abuse, that would actually that's a male-friendly approach to employment. You wouldn't necessarily have to call it that or think about it that way, but by the facts, it would be, because there's more men that would fall into that group.
So the risk of talking twice.
Yeah.
I'd like to say what is cool is that we have people that are willing to share that they're in recovery. So, which, like, what, really? Like, so when there's Recovery Friendly Month or whatever there is, you walk in the door and there's people that have listed themselves and how long they're in recovery. I'm like, really? You do that? So that's an environment where people feel safe, okay? So now here's the flip side. We're like, sort of bragging, we're recovery friendly. We tell people, I stand in front of people like this and say we are. And then about 6 months ago, we find out we do some exit interviews and people are leaving saying, I'm in recovery and I'm trying to stay clean. This is the worst place I could be. Why? Well, third shift, they're selling drugs, they're doing drugs. There's people shooting up in the bathroom. It's like, yeah, well, I guess that's not what we're up to. And so Rooney, who's my son, takes over, and he's in a company meeting. He goes, so here's the story. We're committed to be recovery friendly, and we can either have cops in the parking lot, we can bigger lights, we can do all kinds of things, but we really don't want to do that. We want to be recovery friendly, but we don't know what that means. So I don't know what that means. My son Rooney doesn't know what that means. The leadership team doesn't know what that means. So they went around and asked everybody who was willing to talk. So they came up with the idea that we actually have a paid time. People meet like AA, recovery friendly at Rhino, and they lead it. So that's why I jumped on the mic again. That's that idea that people that think they know the solutions, my solution would have been a horrible solution. The people that have the problem know the solution. And it started every 2 weeks they meet, now they meet every week.
It's great. It's a great story, and it's a great lesson for us to all keep in mind. So I'd like to go to Richard now and ask him, and it sort of piggybacks a little on all of this in terms of, in all the research and things, we're a really rural state. I mean, this is, we're a state of 630,000 people, and Chittenden County is really the only city feel that we have. In your data and all the work you do you see any differences between rural and city? And I think we have Ken's experience and things, but what do you see as, you see some differences?
Yeah. So a lot of the trends that I referred to are deeper or starker in rural areas, and I'll caveat that in a moment. But rural areas have higher suicide rates for men than others. It's where you've seen the biggest wage stagnation, especially for working class men. It's where you'll see these more, quotes, deaths of despair, substance abuse, etc. But also what I'm really interested in, and we're doing some work on this now, is you're seeing a lot of those rural areas, the mobility out of those areas is much higher among women than among men. So geographical mobility rates are generally higher among women now, but they're especially high out of those areas. And so you're seeing some areas now where they're actually, the gender balance is becoming quite skewed. So where I live now, for example, in northeast Tennessee, in Johnson County, Tennessee, there are almost 3 men for every 2 women of working age. And it looks like that's because the women have left. Right? And so that's interesting, and that has all kinds of downstream consequences for the men who are in those areas, who are less likely to leave. So I think our intuition might be, oh well, it's men who leave, go west and all that, but that turns out not to be the case, that they're more likely to stay behind. And then the other thing, the caveat here is that a lot of my work focuses on the intersection with race. And so you see very different patterns for black boys and men especially, right? On most of the things I'm interested in education and employment, it's black boys and men. But that varies hugely by area, right? And which racial group you're talking about in particular. So in the UK, where I'm from and do work, it's actually white working class boys who are doing the worst. And that's true in a lot of parts of the US too, including parts of kind of Tennessee. And so if we think about race and class and urbanicity and rural, what you'll actually find is a lot of the boys, and actually Ian in the book is a good example of this, but a lot of the boys who are struggling most in states like this, I suspect, are white, working class or lower income boys in rural areas, right? And so this is just a good example about you just got to follow the data, because that is not true in Maryland, right? And so if we're committed to kind of following the data, then what we'll find is that actually, somewhat to our surprise, the groups who are struggling most are not the ones that we would necessarily assume would be struggling most. If we think we know at the outset who's struggling most, then we're not doing very good data work. And it's uncomfortable to find out, frankly, that sometimes it's white men. Like, of all the groups that we might be least comfortable discovering need the most help, it's probably white men, right? Especially when it's white men saying it, right? But if that's what the data says, I think we have to be faithful to that. Otherwise, you turn out to kind of, particularly area like, because you're quite white as a state. True, right? I mean, big immigrant population, right? Big immigrant population, and then your immigrant population is very different as well. Lauren and I were talking about this too. And actually, for maybe some of your immigrant groups or New American groups, it might be actually some of the gender issues do still go the other way, right? But not in your white working class rural areas. And so that's why the commitment of all of the people involved here to just follow the data and see where the issue is. But what we can't do is have an ideological prior, right? That we already know that it can't be white men. Right. Well, let's go find out. And maybe it turns out that it is more people like Ian are actually, maybe the median struggling male in your state is a white man or white boy. And that's okay to recognize that and do something about that. It doesn't mean doing less for students of color. But if we don't follow the data, we're in trouble.
Great. Thank you. Ken, I'd like to turn to you for a moment. And, in Gather, you write about a teenage boy, and for people who haven't or who have read it, Ian, who has a ton of skills. And in his case, he's motivated to have a job, but it's still incredibly tough for him. But Ian can fix anything. And he's always on the lookout for a hose clamp lying on the side of the road, and he has a huge collection of inherited spare parts particularly from his grandfather. Because as you say in the book, having stuff makes you feel ready for anything. But even with all this motivation, he still faces a lot of challenges. Can you talk a little bit about that and why that was such an important concept in your book?
Yes.
Or will you?
I will. Ian, I did not. The book was 20 years in the writing, and the plot was fleshed out. And I could not find a character that I could stand to stick with, because initially the characters were too whiny. And finally Ian came onto the page, and what worked for him at the outset was that he was going to take some degree of charge. He had some agency, and a lot of that agency came from his know-how, from his capacity to see something and fix it. And when I drive, a quick story, I have a camp up in the Northeast Kingdom on a pond, and somehow I ended up being the person who, and there's a landowners association around this pond, and I ended up being the person who had to call all of the people who were late with their association payments. And then one day I got to know, and I would send them letters, and I got to know the addresses really well, and I took a different route home, and I was, I know this road. There are 2 addresses on this road. And on the left was, a quite well-kept house, and that was a person that I did not have to reach out to. And on the right, a little further down, was this house that had probably 6 lawnmowers in the yard, and you know, it was just, you know, it was cluttered. And you can probably guess who wasn't paying their association dues. Both of these families had inherited the property on the pond. The one thing was that that if I needed help, if I got my tractor stuck up, you know, it's actually a timber farm, so I'm up there with power tools all the time. Or if I couldn't figure out how to drop a tree, it was the guys with all the stuff in their yard that I would go to for help, and man, they were ready to roll up their sleeves and do something about it. That is a know-how that is absolutely critical, that somehow we don't reward anymore, except when we're trying to be gracious. One of the things that kept Ian having this sense of energy, one of the reasons I could stick with him and tell the story and then eventually couldn't stop, was that he identified still, despite all of the fact that he would go into a classroom and maybe not care about what they needed to cover, was that he still identified as a learner. He just didn't identify as a learner in the school setting. And a lot of our approach right now, our kids don't identify as learners. We train that right out of them. These kids who have mastered, you know, sort of what we consider the apex, the capacity to speak and to communicate as a species is the greatest thing, and then they use it to tell us they're terrible at math. What is it we're doing in our school system that by the time they get to 5th grade, they don't do math? I'm terrible at English. I don't express myself. I don't want to do charades. I mean, we've scared them out of almost everything. And I think that Ian's sense of agency is what kept him going. And that, to me, we talk about the core a lot, core subjects. But the core, after a kid has left the stage with their diploma, is the kid. And we need to hang those subjects on that person, on those emerging identities.
Ken, your comments resonate so much with me. I shared last night that my family farms in New Hampshire, and I spend a lot of time working with, we hire a lot of high school kids, and I spend a lot of time working with a lot of young guys who are just like Ian. And it is painful to hear them when they say, you know, I ask them about school. I oftentimes don't confess to them early on what I do, because I'm just, my brothers are there, like, get to work. And so, you know, I'm just feeding calves or whatever, and I'll say, so how's school? I hate school. What are you doing in school? Well, I don't know why I need to be there.
We have a lot of alternative programs for which failure in the present system is the admissions requirement. And that, to me, is such a mess. Very much in the early stages of creating what we call an opt-in program that would be for every kid, because I think that some of the changes that our boys might need most would actually benefit everyone. And so an opt-in program as opposed to an alt program, something along the lines when we talk about rural, you know, rurality. I was thinking, and actually ended up on the phone with the president of High Tech High in San Diego, California, who grew up in New Hampshire. And I suggested, you know, I would love something in Vermont where it's a rural high-tech high, kind of like San Diego, but we spray it with manure tea and, you know, get some chaff all over it and maybe some sawdust. And that is something people can opt into. And I hope that we can do that.
Thank you. And I'd like to flip over to Sara. And Sara, a lot of the quotes that people are finding on the story cards come from students involved with VSAC. And a lot of them express a tension between working and going to school. Can you talk a little bit about that and give us a few examples of how that plays out in the work every day when you're with GEAR Up students?
Yeah, so there's definitely, I think one of the things we haven't really talked much about is this financial component, right? And the students that we work with in particular in GEAR UP are anywhere from 7th grade to their first year out of high school. And one of the things that we, I think, do a really great job at, and I talked about earlier, was meeting students where they are and making things relevant for them, right? So this know-how, those students who kind of hold this know-how, we want to hear more about that and connect with them about it and explore it with them and really let them know that we see them and we hear them and this is exciting. And during that kind of exploration, we also want to expose them to opportunities that are out there that might look different than anything they've had exposure to before, right? So also the students that we've worked with have been in this system, right? They've been in this education system and they might not know all of the different ways that education can look, right? That know-how is very valuable. And one of the great things that we get to do is connect with them around that and share with them opportunities around growing that. So with the tension, it's like an exploration, right? It's being frank about the information that they might be hearing in the media that one can make poor decisions when connecting with education in the future, right? That's totally possible. But it's also not possible. So we want to help them connect with something that they feel like is relevant and support them in getting there. And that, you know, we have to have a relationship with our students to be able to do that. What's great is that we have a little bit of flexibility outside of the system to have those relationships, to have those conversations and dig deeper, and again, to meet them where they are. So if our plan for the day was to come and talk about all the cool programs that CCV offers, but there was just something in the news that has sparked a different conversation, we get to be there with them and hear them and again, meet them really where they are.
Sarah, can you give us some specific examples of a student that you've worked with that sort of here to give us an example of how you actually work with them?
Yeah, so one student that's really sticking in my mind is kind of also had the friend connection with GEAR UP in particular and at home. So they came from a moderate family income. They're actually just a single dad, so the mom was not in the picture, but dad didn't know much about continuing education after high school. And this kid was really interested in music, like really loved music, and had a friend whose parents had gone on to school, and they kind of helped him learn a little bit and encouraged him to continue to connect with their GEAR UP counselor. So they would meet and explore opportunities to kind of continue this musical interest. So what different professions are out there where one could be in the music industry, because, you know, rural Vermont, that might not be a profession that we hear much about. So and actually VTSU, right, has this great music program. So they kind of were able to explore that with their GEAR UP counselor. They went to one of our awesome events that we put on, that Anna, who's here, puts on for us, where they were able to go to a college campus and learn more about this particular thing and dive into it even deeper. And the really cool thing that came out of that was that then their counselor connected them with another student who was also interested in music. And then the counselor was kind of just there, and the students are communicating now about the options that are out there and kind of using that connection and investment in one another, both male, around taking that next step.
So I'd like to carry on that theme a little bit with TED, because I think one of the things that Rhino is known for is all the creative things you have done to help the employees that you have with them. And yes, you have a lot of males, and I know all the programs you create are for all your employees, but I think it would be wonderful for this group to hear some of the programs that you provide to your employees that really allow them to come to work every day, to stay employed with you, and yet you help them well beyond their 10 or 12-hour shift.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to really understanding the people that work for you, and that's where people really get left off. You know, an example for me was going to a Bridges Out of Poverty thing that the United Way put on in 2007 or something, and realizing that 43% of Americans didn't have $500 in a savings account. It's like, wow, really? Like if my car broke down and I called my mom, even when I'm like 35, she how much do you need, right? You know, so I was like, wow, that's interesting. That's a lot bigger number than I thought, right? And so come back to Rhino with some folks and we're like, wow, no wonder we have people that are some of our best employees just sort of flame out and don't show up to work. And we find out it's because their car broke down. They don't have $500. They're late to work. They're late to school. Their kids, they're late to work. Their kids late to school. Their kids in trouble in school. They lose their job. And so it's like, because they don't have $500. And you're like, well, if that's a good employee, we got to fix it. And so luckily, we go to see Jeff Smith at North Country Credit Union. He should be up here, right? And and we set up a program where you can borrow money up to $1,500 today at Rhino. And it's paid back through payroll deduction. And the big thing is it's not from me, it's not from Rhino, it's through a credit union. So the credit union, what the advantage of that is they have been kicked out of the banking system because they have poor credit. They're afraid to go in because they look stupid, right? So why am I going to go into a bank if they're going to make me feel stupid and fill out a form? So there's no credit score needed, and they get it the next day. So all of a sudden they're at Rhino, they fix their car, fix their hot water heater. They now have a relationship with a lending institution. There's no questions asked, and they pay back their loan, and their credit score goes up. If they don't opt out, they start a savings program. So that's just a good idea, right? But what's good about the idea is this idea that these ideas are everywhere. There's great ideas everywhere in business and school. It's just, what does it take to push through and get it done? These programs are not magical. They're just there, and they take time and effort to decide what's important, and have a different mindset about, like, you know, it's nothing wrong with a person doesn't have $500 in their savings account. If I ask most business leaders, like, what's wrong, they'll tell me what's wrong with that person. I think somebody earlier talked about blame. People love to blame people in different situations. I mean, I just really believe that. It's like, they're really bad at finances. No, guess what? People that don't have money are really good. They don't need financial literacy. They really don't. They go to payday lenders because they're really nice to them. They serve coffee, and they'll give them a loan. They don't realize they're going to get screwed for the rest of their life, but they're nice to them. It's an easy access to money. So all these problems, I think, have a lot to do with just spinning it around and not making people wrong for the situation they're in.
What's striking about the financial literacy thing is that is another example of something that's a big theme of my work anyway, which is to move away from blaming the individual to looking at the systems and structures within which they're making those decisions. They're saying, well, you're financially illiterate. Okay, so financial literacy training will solve that problem, because the basic assumption is it's because they're dumb or illiterate. And I think this speaks a bit to Ken's point about, which I wanted to pick up on around, there's also Freddie DeBoer's book, The Cult of Smart, and all this stuff, which is just this sense of, you said, like, failing at one group is how you get in. And it's a bit like Sarah's point too about meeting students where they are. Sarah Goldrick-Rab has this great line where she says, we're always talking about college-ready students. What we need is student-ready colleges. Right, I think it's exactly the spirit that you're speaking. But that includes this sort of technical thing. It's really interesting to me how the suspicion of and disrespect for, I'll say it that strongly, for kind of more technical and vocational forms of learning, in the US especially, is quite extraordinary. And I think it's bad, period. But I think it's particularly bad for boys and men because on the average, they tend to do a little bit better on those sorts of learning, right, on the average. But again, to your point, technical high schools, which I'm a massive advocate for if they're done well, they skew towards better outcomes. They tend to be more boys selecting into them, and the outcomes for those who go tend to be better for the boys. But they're pretty good for a lot of girls as well, right? That's the nice thing about distributions is they overlap. And so you're going to help some girls along the way, just as like a coding camp is maybe going to help more girls, but it will also help some boys. But it's almost like there's this, and I know that the history of tracking in the US is part of it here, so I'd love people's views on that, because there's this sense of like labeling people as going down a vocational track or being more suitable for that is another way of failing them, because we see that as second class, right? It's this vicious circle. And people say, well, college isn't for everyone's kids. But they never mean their own kids. What they mean is those other people's kids, right? God forbid that my kid should do an apprenticeship or whatever. And until we get past that respect gap, I don't know how you get past the policy gap, because if it's always seen as second class route, right, leading to second class occupations and positions, then I think we're trapped in this horrible doom loop where, like, until we get more status for those different forms of learning. But how do you get that? And that's why Michael Young wrote his book Meritocracy in the first place, was to say meritocracies are horrible places, because the rich people decide what counts as merit, reward that, and look down their noses at everybody else. So I don't know where this leads, except I'd love your responses to tracking, respect. How do we upgrade the value of these forms of learning when, if we're being honest about it, very few of us are encouraging our own kids down those routes because we look at the labour market as it is rather than as we would want it to be?
Well, thank you for that lead-in, because that is exactly one of the questions I was going to ask Ken to talk about. Is you've been involved in the education system for a very long time, and given us some little snippets like the opt-in program. But I would love to have you follow up with Richard's question, and also, how do we, if you could recreate the education system, what would it look like? Where would you start?
Well,
I mean, in the next
With an unlimited budget.
We've got 4 days.
Money,
You
no
guys are all
object.
good. Yeah, go for it now. Yeah.
definitely, I think one of the critical things is teacher training. They're really the alternative approaches, diversifying instruction, all that stuff. What I would love to do is push that technical sensibility into our general education programs, not the other way around. I've been asked, I need more than one hand to ask count the number of times I've been asked to become a high school, a CTE director. And I don't think that's the answer, because by the time our kids, especially in Vermont, where most of our programs start kids as juniors, 11th and 12th grade, we've lost them. They've lost that identity as a learner. Then the tech center gets to be the hero. Hey, it was a completely different person who walked into our door, who left your door. And we don't need a system that depends on heroes. I think, and Richard really, nailed it with the apex of what our gen ed system hopes for is somebody who enters the leisure class. It's not what most of our kids actually want. It's not what brings them a sense of meaning, is to sit down and, have somebody else do the dishes or whatever. One of the things that we have to look for when we're trying to consider how many programs, Mount Abe High School in, I think, is it Lincoln? Bristol. Started a program called Pathways ages ago where kids could decide what they were interested in, and they would attach, so it was the kid first, and then they would attach deep study into whatever interest the student had. They could look at it through the science lens. They could look at it through the social studies lens. That was a beautiful program. I went to visit it and was just blown away. And it included reaching out to mentors in the community who who had areas of expertise in the fields that the students were interested in, and then those people, the mentors, could really make relevant why these subjects mattered. The program kind of took a nosedive when they got a new superintendent who was more worried about test scores. And that is just what keeps happening. And so we have to look at what's really the resistance to all of the changes that we're hoping for. And a lot of times it's class snobbery and fear that the test scores are going to look bad. A lot of the studies that we're doing now are against a background of an educational system that we don't even question anymore. And that boys are not doing well, because I think, having watched, I have 3 kids, I think boys' brains need risk and sensation more than most in order to develop. And in this risk-averse environment, our boys are falling behind. We're in this fear, we're afraid. Was it this week? It was either this week or last week. A staff member came to me and said, "I need you right now." And I was really in the middle of something important, but I went because I don't usually hear that. And it was a student who was standing on a 10-foot ladder in the stairwell, unaccompanied. His teacher was a male who sent him to put up some posters, but first he was up there on the ladder taking out staples. And after, I didn't see a problem with it. So he wasn't like a toddler. He wasn't standing on the top rung. And so, but I stood there and I shot the breeze with the kid for the next 10 minutes. And then afterward, I talked to the teacher and I said, or the staff member, and I said, I didn't really have a problem with that. And she said, well, if he fell, and yeah, but he would fall here, not climbing some cliff, or, we're so terrified of being blamed that we're being so safe that we're alienating a lot of our students.
Yeah. Did you see this stat? I haven't checked this stat, but John Haidt had this stat he used the other day, which he said that there's been this massive decline in physical injuries among kids, especially among teen boys, which you might say, oh, that's great. But actually, I think he said anyway, we're now at a point where a teenage boy is less likely to break his arm than a 50-year-old man. That actually they just don't break their arms anymore, right? And of course, on the one hand, you might say, great, kids don't break their arms anymore. But if you think behind that, you say, well, maybe they should be breaking. Or no, you know what I think you know what I mean. Do you know what I mean? Like most of us broke something, right? And so I think that's probably right. And I do think it's a great example of like the distributions overlap. So there are a lot of girls, right, who think are discouraged sometimes from taking some of those physical risks, right, who would really benefit from doing it. But on the average, you're right, that the distributions do skew a bit more like boys having the chance to take some of those risks, run around, etc. on average. And so it's a difference between having a gender-based policy where you say, oh, the boys should be running around and taking risks, or the girls should, and a gender-sensitive policy which says, actually allowing people to run around and take risks on average is going to benefit the boys a bit more than the girls, but it'll benefit some of the girls, but see that as a feature rather than a bug, right? There's a tendency sometimes to see something that sort of skews as having better male outcomes, like apprenticeships is another great example, skews very male. Is that a feature or a bug? I'd say it's a feature, right? It's not that we don't want women doing apprenticeships, but if it skews male, why is that a problem, given that there are 2.5 million more female students in college now, right? Which skews more female, then it's okay to have some that skew the other way, I think.
So I would like to pose one final question to Richard. And this is really about giving us some advice. But you open your book by talking about your sons. You say, I used to fret about 3 boys and young men, and now I'm worried about millions. And you spent the last few years learning and writing and talking about all of that. And I would love for you to, 2 questions I'd like you to answer. One is, what are you hopeful about? And hopefully tying into that, what advice do you have for us here in Vermont?
I'm really hopeful that this conversation is taking place, honestly, and that more conversations like this are taking place. I think there's just a new permission to talk about this in a way that's not, as you said at the beginning, not zero sum. I think the kind of recognition of this, and I feel once you've set the stage correctly for the conversation, which is very important to do, the outpouring of compassion and empathy and concern is extraordinary. Once you actually create the space to have it, everybody knows a boy or a young man, a brother, an uncle, a nephew who is struggling. And if we give ourselves permission to care about that publicly, what we realize is we're not alone. This is a problem for all of us. And I'm so encouraged that that is taking place now, because you do sort of think, is it just me? It's private, but actually turns out, no, it's not. Right? This is a big public issue, and we should talk about it. And so my advice would be just like Karen having the conversation. I don't think we can overstate the importance of just actually having the conversation and making a lot of our boys and men feel like we're having this conversation. Then follow the data, go and see where the real problems are, then try some stuff, including some of the stuff we've heard about here, then evaluate it. Always make sure you're disaggregating your data by gender as well as by race, etc., and looking at the outcomes. So that's the boring bit. Absolutely do all that. But because this has been a neglected issue, except I would say by some more reactionary figures, especially online, the mere fact of the discussion, states are setting up commissions on boys and men. There's going to be a men's health strategy in the UK. I'm sure there's stuff coming out of the ministry. Whatever's in those is almost second order at this point to the fact of them, because it allows people to feel. I was at a private meeting in the UK recently. It was with a very progressive group, and this 24-year-old young man from this very left-wing group, and they had this event on boys and men, and he turned up and he said, and he's a member of this group, he said, the fact that this group was having a discussion about boys and men made me feel like someone put their arm around me. He said, the physical sensation has, wait, what? We're talking about boys and men? We're allowed to talk about this? He said, I honestly felt, and he's a bit tearful about it, and I was like, well, you see what this small gathering did for that one young man? Let's do that for millions of young men by having conversations like this. And you start here, and you start with groups like this, and so I'm super excited that you're having this conversation at all.
Thank you, and thank you to our panelists. But I would like to we have a few minutes I would love to open it up now for some questions, and you can ask to an individual or to collective.
I'm Dodie Mitchell. I chair the VSAC board, and as Sara pointed out, we are about the student or the workforce student as well. And I have loved everything I have heard here. You are a group of rich, intelligent people bringing a lot to the table. As I think about our next strategic plan, which will come in a couple of years, I acknowledge that we have no control over the education system in Vermont except through the student. However, from time to time, we have a voice. How would you suggest we use our voice, when we can, to change the system? Because that's what I hear we need to do. Redshirting may work, but it also may segregate a large population. That's changing a piece of the system. It's not changing the part that we need to do, which is really the whole system. So any suggestions? I'm listening.
Yeah, well, I was trying to avoid the disagreement about redshirting, but let's have it. Look, I'll repeat what I said earlier. Simply by sharing the data, by lifting up these issues, is huge. It's just so important to just acknowledge. The mere fact of acknowledging, as we're doing in this conversation, that's really important. So if you have a voice, and you're a trusted voice, and your voice that someone won't immediately dismiss as, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? He's a rank misogynist, which no one's going to say about you. All right? I think that really matters. I mean, there's like Norway's Commission on Boys and Men is about to report. Norway has a Commission on Boys and Men, and I went over there and I'm like, well, was this politically controversial? Because it's very controversial in the US to try and create a Commission on Boys and Men. They're like, no, of course not. Look at the data. And I'm like, yeah, but didn't people? They're like, no. And I said, look, they said, we're Norwegians. No one thinks we hate women. Right? Whereas in the US, there's this kind of thing like, oh, why do right? So actually, if you're a voice and you're a trusted voice, that means you have both an opportunity and I would say a responsibility to raise these issues when they're there. As to what that means in practice, look, if we have an argument about whether or not starting boys in school a little bit later is a better idea than changing the system so that it works better pedagogy, I'm happy to have that discussion, because guess what we're talking about? Boys, and how to improve the education system for boys, right? And I've actually got an exchange coming out with a scholar on this question of redshirting. And so I'll be honest, I think I just want to have a discussion about solutions. And there are some places piloting this later school start. I don't yet know whether or not the evaluations are going to come in well or not. But that's one. Technical high schools you've already heard about, and kind of like much elevating CTE, I think that's huge. And the other thing I would just add, male teachers. How are we encouraging more men into the teaching profession, especially in subjects like English, where we see this kind of reading crisis and literacy crisis? And so I think we need really strong efforts now to arrest the decline in the share of men into teaching. Because I really worry if we get below 20%, which is where we're heading now, it's just going to get harder and harder and harder to persuade men. So I think that the workforce thing, and you mentioned teacher training, the teacher training schools skew much more female than the teaching profession. So the pipeline looks even more female. And if you go into those teacher training colleges and you spend any time in them, actually you're right about the technical stuff, but it's just more generally, it's not, I don't think that those schools are doing a good enough job of kind of training teachers who will serve our boys and girls equally well. And so I think that the workforce side of it, the teacher workforce side of it is huge. And of course we have these shortages as well. But let's not try and solve our teacher shortages with half the labor force. Let's try and get more men in as well.
Next question.
Hi, Jay Jacobs, he, him, at the University of Vermont. Richard, your last anecdote about the group in the UK and that one young man who said he felt like he had his arm wrapped around him. It's one thing having the conversation, starting the conversation here. How do we make sure that our boys know that we're having the conversation, right? We're writing op-eds, we have a documentary coming out, apparently. We're on CBS Sunday Morning, you know, these kinds of things. Our young boys and young men are not reading those, watching these. How do we make sure that they know we're talking about it?
I think one of the things when we're looking at data, we have to remember, which is absolutely critical, of course, but we have to remember that it's made up of n's of one. And that's where the listening that Dodie talked about and that Sara talked about is so critical. That when we can talk to these kids and quote the data and then listen to them and help them see where they fit in, and then have them talk, when we talk to them, let them know that they're part of the solution process. I think that we're collaborating with the people who are in the system is pretty critical. And Dodie, I just wanted to say another challenge that we're facing now that we weren't before because it wasn't possible. I'm now teaching the children of the children who are alienated by No Child Left Behind. I don't have half the time I do not have allies in the parents, and that's another driver for that I'm hoping puts pressure on the need to change the system.
So you're right, people don't necessarily hear it, but it seems to me the worst of all worlds is to have some work around the issues of boys and men, but do it really quietly and hope that no one notices. Right? Because then you're gonna piss off the people you're gonna piss off anyway, because they'll know, right? But you're not gonna reach the people you need to hear you, which is the boys and men, right? So it seems to me if you're gonna do it loud. Try and get cut through. Try and use opportunities. So if you set up institutions or task forces or whatever they're called around boys and men, find people to go out and talk about it. Do it super loud. Turn up the volume. Use opportunities like the fact that this is going to become a Vermont Read to open up a conversation about white working class boys in rural areas in the state. Use that to draw attention to the work you're doing on boys and men. Who are the local people who are going to get the voice on this? get loud with it. Otherwise, if you're going to do it, right? It seems to me, because part of the point of doing it is to send a different message to our boys and men. And you're right, it is through stories that you'll do that, and beautiful stories like this one. I have to say one more thing. The dog that is a thought is, I may not be the only person who feels like maybe a dog helped save the life of their son. And so that's very beautiful here. And he says, never leave your dog. But the key thing is, he spends half his time worrying about how to feed the dog, because the dog needs him. The dog needs him. And unless being unneeded is fatal to the human condition, and so it's this beautiful story for all kinds of reasons, but one is the dog keeps him alive because he keeps the dog alive. So as a reminder of how much we depend on each other, including animals, couldn't be better.
Next question. We're going to move on to this side of the room for a moment.
Hi, my name is Tanya, and I have the honor of being the executive director at the Boys and Girls Club of Burlington. And one thing we've been working on particularly hard in the last few years is emotion coaching. So helping kids to, and our staff, all of us, to identify, particularly in hard times, what we might be feeling, and using that to work through a problem, as opposed to stuffing it in and never really making progress. And I think all of us would agree we live in a society where that is particularly hard for boys and men. And so, Richard, I'd be curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. It's interesting that there aren't that many programs aimed at boys that have been very well evaluated, but one of the best ones is the Becoming a Man project in Chicago, who worked specifically with black teenage boys, and it worked a lot on these emotional skills, the difference between making a decision in a hot state and a cold state. It was basically a lot of cognitive behavior therapy wrapped in, honestly, and it worked really, really well. The importance of emotional skills is already very high and will get higher. It's more important in relationships. So if I like to think of it as relational skills, like in the workplace, interpersonal skills in the workplace are getting more important. You know, few people can now go through a working day without talking to somebody, right? So that's important. In relationships are much more important, right? If you have more equal relationships, which we thankfully do now, that takes a lot more negotiation and relational skill to kind of make work. So the premium on relational skills is going up. Are we doing a good enough job of creating those in boys? No. I think that's where actually some male spaces are really good for that, actually, where boys can learn some of that stuff together. But the last thing I'll say on this is, whilst it's hugely important we invest in it, we also do so in a way that isn't inadvertently treating boys like malfunctioning girls. That isn't saying the equivalent of, the trouble with boys is that they aren't girls. And what I mean by that isn't to say that they shouldn't be more emotionally available and so on, but to do so in ways that are sometimes just more comfortable for boys. So I'll give an example, which I don't think I talked about last night, but the difference between shoulder-to-shoulder and face-to-face communication. Did I talk about that last night? There's evidence, actually, just on the average, again, brackets, everything's on the average, but on the average, men are a bit more comfortable communicating shoulder-to-shoulder than face-to-face, right? And there are apparently deep evolutionary reasons for this. Men who are face-to-face are probably about to fight, so cortisol spikes and so on. But for whatever reason, and you can track it apparently, if you go to like parties and stuff, you look at the angles that men stand at, and we're just much less likely to be directly face-to-face for that reason. And so it means that, and so coaching while you're sitting on the bench, hugely important. A lot of therapists now do walk and talk therapy, where they walk while they're talking. It's the only explanation. This shoulder-to-shoulder thing is the only explanation for golf. There is literally no other evolutionary explanation for it, because what men do is that when they're saying to each other like this, do you think I should use the 5-iron for this or not? What they're really saying is, I really love you. Right? Now, the thing is, that's okay to a certain extent. It's fine. So create spaces where coaches and talking and walking just have ways of communicating, and some women will benefit from that too. Don't sit them, like my wife used to do with our teenage sons, don't sit them down, stare them in the face and ask them how their day was at school. Well, don't do that. She'd be like, they'd never answer. She's literally like this. So how was your day? What did you learn? Have some protein. Did you eat protein, right? And they'd be like, no, I don't know, nothing. And then later on, we'd be driving somewhere or playing a video game or something or going to soccer, and they'd be like, this weird thing happened today. This girl said this thing, and like, oh, right, what was that? You're in the car sometimes, or whatever. Why? Because you're shoulder to shoulder. And it's okay, and it's one of the reasons I'm so obsessed with the declining share of male therapists, because male therapists very often just get that. They don't have to be taught to do it, they just know it because we're a bit different. In the same way that male therapists, if we only had male therapists, we'd probably have to teach them. A lot of women are more comfortable communicating face to face. Why are you walking around and playing golf with her? She wants to sit in a coffee shop and stare at you for an hour. Right? Again, I'm overstating it for the point of effect, but like, yes, we should do it, but we should make sure we're doing it in a way that kind of gives space to the pluralism of emotional expression and allow for some differences on average between boys and girls.
Next question. Oh, sorry. Couple more questions. All right, who'd like to be next? All right, we'll go down here.
Hi, I'm Shabnam Nolan. I'm the Executive Director of King Street Center. We're a youth development organization in Burlington, serving 18 months to 18 years. A large part of our population is, predominantly low income, and a large part of that is our immigrant refugee community here in Burlington. And you mentioned this briefly about sort of cultural norms and how that could play into what we're seeing. And I'm curious, we've just started an academic and career exploration program that is really targeted at high school, but most particularly at the 9th and 10th grade population. What we're finding, and it's our first year in it, is that there's slightly more actual engagement by boys in the program. Now, there are some cultural reasons for that. However, we have a lot of engagement by boys right now. Once they hit 18, we start to see this shift where they're less engaged, or as they get older and older in high school. So I guess my question to you is, what is your advice for a program like ours, where we are in fact seeing a large engagement by boys, to help ensure that that engagement stays at that level?
I'm happy to have a go, but I'm interested in others. So first of all, it's a great example of got to go where the data is, right? And so it may well be that there are certain groups in any kind of situation where there's still more reason to be worried about the educational engagement of girls than boys. And of course, if we pan out and think about this globally, that's absolutely true, right? So there are many nations, but there are also many groups within nations where there's still the traditional way of thinking about this, which is, and you briefly mentioned some cultural reasons. It may well be that there are certain new American groups where actually there is still a higher priority placed on male education than female education. So there, we need to do more for the girls and try and work in a way that's sensitive its own around that, right? So great example of the need to not assume that it's going to be true for all groups. But then what happens at 18, I suspect, is that there may also be issues too. It's like you need to get into the labor market. So then a different thing might kick in, which is like, what does it mean to be a man and live as a man, etc. Well, you get out to work. And so there, it might start to kick the other way, which is like the expectations of men, especially to be breadwinners and to be contributing to family income, is distorting their educational journey. It might be great for them to go do that, but it might also mean that they're underutilizing some of their educational capital, potentially. And so it's complicated, and I don't envy you, but it looks like you might have some kind of, in the earlier stages, you might have to be dealing with some issues around the role of girls in education, but then as you get higher up, you might be dealing with some issues around the role of men once they become adults. My dad had that. When my dad went off to college, his family virtually disowned him because he was from a single mum, single parent family, and everyone went to the factory, and they're like, how dare you go and spend 3 years with books when your mum has raised you and everyone else is in the factory? Like, what are you doing? It was very difficult for him to kind of overcome that. And that was back then, and that was in Birmingham and in industrial England. So it's different, but I suspect something like that will be playing out as well. And so it cuts both ways. I don't have an answer. I've just given you a sort of rambling assortion of thoughts. But that's where your question led me.
Anybody else have a question? All right, we're going to go with you first and then pass the mic to this gentleman over there.
Hello, I'm Bree Droppa. I'm a rural librarian here in Vermont, so this conversation on education is, kind of adjacent to what I do. I wanted to thank Ken for writing a book with a dog on the cover where the dog doesn't die. So I have kids who will not read books with the dog on the cover unless they know and they're assured by their trusted teacher or librarian that the dog won't die. So that was my first introduction to this book. I had a kid hand it to me and say, "Can you read this? And let me know if the dog dies or not." And I was happy to hand it back to that child and say, "No, but I think you're going to love this book." There's so many things that I could say or want to say about this, but I want to kind of hear from Ken, what are your hopes and dreams for Ian? Because, this character kind of ends ends with high school. So what are your hopes and dreams for him?
If you read really carefully and you keep a very close timeline, you'll realize that by the time he's done telling this book, he is just a few months shy of being 18. And I had a couple of folks tell me that they were sure he was going to vote Republican, which I just did not see this as part of this book. But then I thought about it, and I thought, if you look at the data, you're probably right. And this is my hope for Ian, is he's going to be 18. He's right on the cusp of blameability. He is right at the point where we're a legal adult, where we can read this book that's full of incredibly tough stuff, all of the excuses you need, but now you're 18 and you're an adult. And my hope is that he navigates it with the same degree of understanding people are willing to afford minors.
Great. Next up, we have Tim.
Thank you all for being here. I want to just kind of make a comment and a question that from the perspective of a parent of an earlier generation. Because I'm one of the couple people here that was born before 1952. I had two children. I have two children, 7 years apart, and my daughter was in school in that time when we put a great deal of emphasis on creating opportunities for girls. And part of that goes to something you said, Ken, that had to do with risk aversion and the impact of kids not breaking bones anymore. Part of what the theme was at that point was, let's create opportunities for girls to be more physical. Title IX was a big part of that. And we introduced an element of risk into our daughters' lives that we have then kind of taken back out of every kid's life. And I had a son 7 years later for whom very bright, very smart, knows how to do things, for whom school was the worst possible place to be. I'm hesitant to overlay my 1950s childhood white middle-class male view on all of this on a generation of kids that I have really no idea the environment that they're operating in. I may think I do, but I don't. So my plea back to you who are in the classroom or in schools with these kids is, let's make sure that we trust you to know that, as opposed to thinking that my generation, two generations removed from the realities that these kids are in, do that. And we need to trust our teachers and trust our schools to do that in the same way as we get older, we trust doctors to take care of the stuff that we need. Thank you.
Anybody else have a question they'd like to ask?
Final parting shot. Yes, Beth, I feel like you've got what you wanted to ask.
Going once. Oh, Dan. All right.
That's a lot of pressure, Lauren, because I thought you aced the close last night. First, again, I just want to reiterate some gratitude. Panelists, you come together, But honestly, I told Ken last night that after I read his book, I hammered it in about 18 hours because it's a quick read, but I knew Ian growing up. I can picture that kid walking down shirtless on the side of the road after something happened and he blew up. I knew that kid. So I think about this question, and it's not a zero-sum game, but it's an incredibly consequential conversation for us civically and economically and socially in Vermont, which is a place we all care about, but it's not inconsequential for us nationally. What was the quote from Robert Putnam in his book, Our Kids? If we, let me see if I get the quote right. We might ponder whether the bleak, disengaged, future-facing poor young kids today is going to have unanticipated political consequences tomorrow. Now, Richard was very clear last night. He doesn't like to talk about the political angle of this because it's not a partisan thing, but it is the risk of anti-democratic behavior and authoritarian bias. And all these things are taking root in the places where institutions have turned their backs and expressed indifference to the things the data tells us. And I don't know, from the perspective of a community foundation, which is a privileged institution embedded with wealth, financially secure and politically, if we're making a statement of indifference to the things the data tells us, to the things the voices tell us on our chairs from the GEAR UP counselors at VSAC and gathered, then we're whistling past the civic and community graveyard. That's important for us as a foundation to wrestle with. It's not a zero-sum conversation because it's true across our communities in the ways in which institutions have turned their backs on people. What I'm just grateful for is the fact that we have found space for a conversation like this, the way we've found space for other conversations. And I'm also looking forward to identifying the things that will accelerate our hope about what to do about it. So how do we challenge ourselves to redefine the ideas of service and duty and create a new sense of what it means to be a man in a Vermont community in ways that allow people to re-engage with a sense of purpose. What was, Richard, I've either seen you write it or seen you say it, but there's data behind the words that people identify when they take their own lives. Useless, right? Worthless. And so we need to create a culture that imbues and makes a clear statement about worth and utility across the board. And we're going to be dealing with it on a micro level in our own relationships or a macro level in the conditions we see in our communities. And it all starts with, a couple of days like this. And I will say, Ken is the only person in the room who made me cry with his book. Richard's was interesting, but Ken...
Made you cry for different reasons.
Anyway, thank you, everybody, and thank you to our panelists. Thank you, Sara. Thank you, Ted. Thank you.